Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisanzavul, and in this tutorial we're going to have a look at how to sculpt wooden beams. And we're going to have a look at a couple of methods of doing this. The first one using traditional sculpting techniques in Blender and the sculpt mode, and the other one using alpha textures as brushes. So if you're only interested in one of them, you can use the chapters in the video to be able to skip straight to the one that you're interested in. So here we've got our default cube. I'm going to press S to scale it up a little bit, and then I'm just going to press S and Y to make something a little bit longer that's going to represent our beam. Now as always, we're going to press Ctrl and A and apply the scale, otherwise this causes a lot of problems in sculpting. And then we're going to go straight into sculpt mode for the first of these techniques. So if you've got machine tools, you can just press tab and come to sculpt mode here. Alternatively, you can go to the top and click sculpt mode. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we can actually sculpt on this. At the moment, there's not enough vertices to do anything. If I come over with my brush, you can see nothing happens until we go to a corner. So I'm just going to undo that. So to get enough vertices, we need to remesh it. We can come to the remesh options up here, but we don't really have a visual representation of what the voxel size is. The easiest way is to press Shift and R, and then we get this boxed off section, and I can just move my mouse to the left or the right to make those bigger or smaller. And I'm going to want something relatively fine for this because I want to go into a lot of detail. So I'm going to go for something about 0.013. And then to actually do the remesh, at the moment this hasn't remeshed anything, we have to press Ctrl and R, or we can go up here, you can see that voxel size has been put in, and click remesh. Now we can tell that's been done if we just press tab and go into edit mode, and we can see here how dense this has made this mesh. We've got so many here that we can barely see it. I'm actually going to go into face mode, and this should give a bit of a better view, but we can see how small these faces are, as small as those little squares were when we press Shift and R. So back into object mode, and I'm actually going to make a copy of this, so I'm going to press Shift and D and duplicate that just over here, and that's going to be the one we'll do our second technique on. So back to this one and back into sculpt mode. So there are a number of decisions that you're going to need to make here. The most important of them is what sort of style you want this wood to look like. Do you want it to be relatively realistic, or do you want it to be much more stylized in appearance? And therefore, if you want it to be more stylized, you're going to miss out on certain details, and that's going to be really important in this sort of decision-making process. So what I'm going to do is go for something slightly between the two. I'm going to make it a bit more stylized, but it should still be fairly realistic. I'm going to start this off with the crease brush. So what I'm going to do is just bring out the brushes here so you can see them, and let's grab that crease brush here. Let's have a quick look at how big it is. And at the moment, it's far too large, so I'm going to undo that. So I just need to fiddle around with my radius to get this relatively small. I can do that up here, or I can just press F, and that allows me to move around with that. And we'll have to have a look at our strength as well. So let's zoom in and see what this looks like. So that's not too bad. I just want the strength a little bit more as we're going to really dig into our mesh here. That should be okay. Let's try a little bit larger. That's quite a lot, but actually when we look at it side on, it's not too bad. And I'm just going to undo that, and I'm going to make my radius really small. So I approach this in a relatively unusual way, having seen some other tutorials on what people do. I actually tried to start with the fine details, and I've seen a lot of people starting with the larger details. So all I'm going to do is just start with some random bits here, and you'll notice I'm not worrying too much about the texture. I just want to get down some interesting lines that are going to help add to this sort of overall look of the wood. As I said, I'm not paying too much attention to this. I'm just going through, making a lot of lines. You can come to the end, and there's going to be some overlap here, and it's not looking particularly neat, and I do appreciate that to begin with, this looks pretty rubbish. Trying to make them not perfectly straight, you want some sort of curves here, and basically just something like this. And this is this fine-grained wood texture that we get on maybe some sort of old beam where the texture's starting to split apart slightly. So we just end up with something that looks like this. Not particularly neat, but it gets the point across, okay? It's starting to look like wood, and we can always come out and move along a little bit. So let's just carry that on. I can just do these sort of wiggly lines. They're going backwards and forwards, just to get everything looking a little bit scratched up. They don't have to go all the way across, just something a bit like that. So at the moment we've got the beginnings of our wood texture. As I say, not looking great. Now we're going to start working on the larger details next. So I'm going to go, and this depends on what you want. I have a tendency to use the draw brush here for this. I'm just going to put the radius up. That probably is too much. Let's shrink that down a little bit. Let's undo that. And we want to make sure this is going in, so I'm going to press the minus button, and I'm going to get my strength up quite a bit. Okay, that's looking relatively okay for this sort of slightly stylized look. I might make this a little bit smaller. Now at this point we're going to start focusing on some of the larger shapes of the wood, and this is going to make these larger grains the main sort of structure. And this is where we really want to start defining things like knots. For example, I might move something out there, so we start getting this knotted shape. And the longer you sort of make these brush strokes, the better they're going to look. Don't be afraid to do something and then go back and change it, so either undo it or fiddle around with it a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with that. It's relatively easy. Just sort of keep playing, and just from the very nature of wood, eventually this will actually just start to look a little bit better. Now I'm using a tablet for this. It does make this slightly easier. You can do this with a mouse if you want to have a look at the technique that I've done previously, which goes through and has a look how to use a mouse to do relatively smooth lines. There's a video for that in the top right hand corner, so you can have a look at that. It is quite a useful technique, and actually it's quite fun to do that anyway. But you'll notice I'm generally following the pattern of the wood grain that I've laid down. And all that's happening here is all the wood grain and the little scratches that I put in earlier are just adding a little bit to the texture here. It's just making things a little bit more interesting, giving me a bit of a guide, and I'm just sort of noticing the places where I really want to do this. So as I said, slightly stylized, going a little bit over the top with some of the areas. Something a bit like that. And then what I can do is come in with the draw sharp, should I choose to, and make some of these a little bit harsher. So this really helps to define those grains, define the smaller scratches that we've got, and this might also be where, if this is a particularly battered bit of wood, you might want to to up the size a little bit and start putting in those sort of scratches, maybe there, that aren't actually part of the wood grain, they're part of the damage that's happened to this wood structure. Now, how far you want to go with this is entirely up to you. Do have a think about the scale you're working at. Especially for something like a 28mm model, you do want to have some of these fairly exaggerated. If we have a look at side on, okay, you can see how deep some of these are going and some of them aren't particularly deep. For example, this part here, I might want to go deeper with that. Similarly here around this knot. That might be good to have a little bit deeper. Just keep on fiddling until you're happy with it. Okay. Now this next bit is entirely optional, and I will say you can actually do this to begin with, and it's quite a good place to start, and that is using the scrape brush. Now, what I generally use with the scrape brush, or do with the scrape brush, is try to add these, or have a look at this on the edges. So for example here, this is going to start flattening out certain edges where realistically, if you're looking at something in a sort of fantasy setting, you're not very likely to get perfectly squared off wood in the way that this looks. Now, some people actually like doing this bit first. That's perfectly valid. I generally do it a little bit later just because it means that at this point I can see the structure of my wood. I can see where the wood is going to be a little bit more susceptible to damage. For example, here, where you've got that, and here where it's getting a little bit close to the edge, that would be a good place to do there. So I find this a bit useful to do later, but that's really just up to you. If you're doing something very simple with this, you could quite easily do this as the first thing. I've seen that done in a lot of tutorials. Do pay special attention to the corners. They're going to get relatively knocked up. Though at the same time, if this is going to be connected to another beam of wood that's going to be along here, those corners actually are going to probably be relatively intact. As with this edge here, you might have a little bit of wear and tear from where it was actually machined. Well, not machined is sort of the point of this. Whereas some of the corners would be relatively protected. Now, one other thing you can do is, it's quite useful to go over this and actually flatten this out. Now, if I was going to do this, normally I'd do this before I did these scratches, but again, it's entirely up to you. So if I just bring down the strength of the scrape brush a lot, press F and really up the size of it, you can just, maybe that's a little bit too low, you can just scrape this over the top of your surface, and you'll notice what that is not doing, and this is an important difference, is it is not smoothing this. It doesn't take away any of the texture, it's just flattening it off, like maybe you'd get if someone had been sat on this or constantly walking over it. So you can use this to tell a bit more of a story. If this is your steps and you've got this maybe in a tavern, you might want to scrape out this section more, as that's going to be the area people walk over the most, and these bits at the side are not. So you've got some choices there of how you're going to use this scrape brush. And again, this really, I'm just undoing that a little bit, really tells a story here of, for example, when did this nick happen? When did this scratch occur? Did this happen relatively early on and then it's been smoothed over by people walking over it? Or is this much more recent? For example, at the moment, this one looks like a relatively old bit of damage that's been there for a long time. But if I come back to the draw sharp brush, again, drop down my radius and do something like that, especially if we go over it a couple of times, actually in the same place would be a good plan. You can see this should look like it's much more recent than that one, as it's been worn down. And you can always, as I said, add to that with the scrape brush to start exaggerating that a little bit more. Something a little bit more stylized, but we often want to go for this stylized large texture so that it will show up on our miniatures when we 3D print them. So let's move on to our alternative method, this time using alpha textures to create brushes that we're going to use to texture this. This is going to create a much more detailed texture in most instances, and we do have to be a little bit careful about the level of detail that we want to go to, and there are a few positives and negatives of this technique, and a few things that you want to be careful of, especially when sculpting something like wood. Now, I'm going to take this from a general point of view of using alpha textures as a brush, and then we'll talk about the wood element later. So we're going to go through the basics, then talk about some of the complexities of using this to sculpt wood. So the first thing that we need to do is set up our brush, and we're going to do that by taking one of our brushes. I'm going to click on the draw brush, and then we're going to set up a new brush texture for it. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and go into the active tool settings, and you can see here that I've got my settings for my brush, and they're still where we were previously. I'm going to go back to add, just because that's what's normally here and what is most typically used for a texture brush, and then I'm just going to scroll down to where it says texture. Now at this point we can create a new texture, so I'm going to press plus and we can name that texture. I'm going to call this wood. And now we need to add the alpha that we've got here. Now there are a number of places that you can get alpha textures. If you just go to Google and type in alpha texture, you're going to get a range of these different images that you could use, and you'll find a number of good websites that are particularly useful for finding them. I find textures.com is quite useful, though a lot of the time it has textures, not just alpha textures. The other one that I use quite a lot is Pixologic. Now this is primarily designed for ZBrush, but alpha textures are the same wherever you get them from. And if you scroll down, you come to this library where you've got all of these alpha textures. And from this, if you don't know, you can get an idea what an alpha texture is. It is essentially a texture that is made up using blacks, whites, and then all the greys in between. And you've got several options here. For example, you've got different ground textures, you've got different natural textures. Some of them are actual images and things like that. For example, these wings, and you've got different objects like, for example, rocks. Now, I'm not actually going to use one of these. I'm going to use an alpha texture that I've made myself. And if you want to have a go at this using the same textures that I have, I'm going to put a link to the file where you can grab those in the description. It's just a Google Drive file and you can just download them as you want. There's nothing to pay, so just feel free to use that. If anyone's interested in how to make alpha textures from things like photos and whatever sort of images that you might want to use, I'm more than happy to do a video on that. Just let me know in the comments. It's not a particularly difficult thing. It just requires a little bit of know-how and a little bit of practice to see what you want to get. So what we need to do is set up this texture, and we've got two options here. I can either come down to the texture properties at the bottom, or I can click the image next to that, and that will just bring you down here. There's no difference. And at the moment we've got our brush, which is wood, and we've got our image, and this is where normally you could use different textures that are automatically part of Blender, or you can come down here and click open. So I've come to where I've got this alpha texture, or my alpha texture saved, and I'm just going to click on this one, which is a wood alpha. You'll notice it's quite blurred. So when you make it, you have to blur it yourself, and that gives you actually a better texture. So while this sort of looks like wood, it's not perfect, and there are a few other things that we need to sort out here. So let's fix those first. Now at the moment, if I come in and try to use this and go like that, you're going to see we do get this wood texture, but it's one, going in the wrong way, and two, we've got these really harsh lines where it's trying to join up the bits of the alpha texture that it doesn't know what to do with. So we've basically got a join there and a join there, and that is joining up that edge and that edge. And we don't want that. That's not going to work, and there's a reason that's coming up. And if I go to my brush here, it is because we've got this mapping down as tiled. We don't want that. We want area plane, which is going to limit it to our surface, and it's just going to use the same texture again and again. The other reason we want area plane, though it's not visible on this, is if you've got a curved surface, you can get your alphas distorted by that curve unless you use this area plane method. And now if I go along, we've got something that should look a bit more like wood, but you'll notice it's just got the same pattern again and again and again. And if I undo that and just click once, that's much better. And then I could click once, and then I could click once, and then there. And we've got our wood texture, but again, it's very repetitive. We need to have a bit more control over how this is going to be set up. So we do this actually in the brush settings up here, and we come to stroke, and we change the stroke from space to what we call anchored. And what this means is I'm going to click, it creates the texture, and then as I pull, it makes this larger, and I can rotate this round in different directions. Now, first thing that we should mention is this is vastly too exaggerated. That does not look like wood. So I'm going to have to deal with my strength up here, bring that down, and that's looking a little bit better. So we've got our wood texture here, and that's looking a little bit nicer. And I can do things like this. I can put them over the top of each other so that they merge together, and we can start building up our wood texture. Now, just to be clear about this, if I was doing this properly, I would generally try to use more than one brush. So I'd have more than one wood texture, and I might use a combination of these brushes together. But even without that, you can see that this is starting to make a relatively nice texture here that looks a little bit like wood grains. You could even argue that in the middle here we've got something like a knot that's going to be there. And this is how you use alpha textures. Effectively, you put it in and it's going to create a surface. Now this next bit's going to be very important in determining how you use your alpha texture. So just to be clear what's happening, what we've got in this image here is whites and blacks and greys, and the blacks are areas where when you use the brush there is going to be no raise in height. So here and here and here it is just staying at the same height, whereas all the whites are going to raise that surface up. Now this causes a problem for wood because, well, we want a wooden beam, and a wooden beam is not going to have this texture sticking out of it. It would have been made relatively flat. We want the texture going into the surface. So if I just undo this, Logically, you'd think that I could just click minus to turn this into a subtract brush and use this, and it's going to start subtracting into it. And, well, you'd be right. If I start having a look at this now, we've got our texture going into our surface. And if I start building this up a little bit, I guess you could argue this looks a little bit like wood, but it definitely feels like there's something wrong with it. And the reason for that is that we're essentially using the texture the wrong way, and we've got these very thin lines coming out. That's normally the bits that dip into the wood, but here they're the black parts, and that means that they don't indent very much. So in effect, while this is digging in, everything's in reverse. The bits that should be dug in here are the bits that are sticking out, and the bits that should be sticking out are the bits that are most dug in because they're the white parts. So you can't really use an alpha brush the wrong way round. I mean, you can, but this doesn't look like wood. It looks like some sort of gnarly skin, something like that. It definitely doesn't look very good as a wood texture. So what we have to do if we want this to work, we want, if I just undo this, the bits on this image, we want the black parts should be the bits that are digging in. They're the bits of the grain that should go in, and the white bits are the bits that should stick out. But we can't do this because if I try to make the white bits stick out, then they're actually going to stick above the wood surface. So that doesn't function correctly. So for something like wood, where you want something indented into it, but your image is going to have the darker bits as the bit that stick in, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have an inverted version of this colorized surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this out. So I'm going to go to texture, and I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to open my other image. So my other image here is the same. It's actually a little bit zoomed out, but that doesn't really make a difference. But it is now inverted. So if I open this up, and at this point, white bits are the bits that should stick in, and the black bits are the bits that should be the flat surface. And now if I use a subtract brush and start doing the same thing, I'm going to have to put the strength up of this. That might be a little bit much. Let's try a little bit less. Let's go for 0.65 or thereabouts. That looks okay. Could possibly be a bit more textured. We'll see. So now I've got something that is going to look more like wood. These bigger areas, the flatter areas, are the areas that aren't dipping in as far, and the wood grain is the bit that's sticking in. And now I can start fiddling around with this, using some different sizes and some different placements. And what I'm doing is I'm actually just lining up some of the lines on these images, but you'll notice I'm not lining up the same ones to themselves. I'm making a much more interesting texture. Sometimes I'll rotate them around the other side. What I can do is I can start going over the top of each other here. So for example, I could turn that one around there and start making something that looks like a little bit more like a knot. And if I wanted to, I could always up the strength on certain bits. So for example, there, I'm going to do a bit of a stronger texture. Might do the same bit there. And then I'll come to a lower strength, do something over here. And again, I will be clear about this. At the moment, I'm using one brush. If I wanted to do this well, I'd probably be using maybe a combination of 2, maybe even 3, to go over the top of this area and make sure that where I'm going over this, there's not too much repetition. But you'll notice that even with this just one brush texture, because we're going over the top of it, you can't notice that there's too much repetition. It looks really varied and quite sort of gnarled up, this wood texture. And again, we've got everything looking right. It's sticking into my wood as opposed to sticking out because I've got this inverted image. Now let's be clear about this. This is very, very detailed. If this is going to be, let's say, a section of a 28mm model, this is going to be too detailed. You're not going to see most of this. It's not going to print out. Whereas if this is going to be something larger, this would be fine. If you did want to make this a 28mm model, you could use this, but you're going to have to exaggerate it quite a lot by putting up the strength and having things that indent more. But at some point, even though this is real wood, like this texture is from real wood, it's not going to look as realistic as the stylized version. It's not going to be as instantly recognizable. Now, at the same time as that, while this looks a little bit much here, we can do things to sort this out. For example, I mean, if this was maybe the bark of a tree, this could look quite good. But again, we can use this scrape brush make it nice and large using the F key to make it larger. And again, I'm just going to scrape over this. And suddenly, actually, this feels a little bit better as a wood texture. It's taken away some of the excessive texture and left just the sort of more gnarly bits. And again, I could come in if I wanted to and start working on these edges here to make this a little bit more accurate as this worn down piece of wood, depending on what I want. Now, the last thing that I just want to add to this, which I've been trying to experiment with a little bit recently, that's quite fun, is actually going a little bit further with this, and that's combining the two of these together. There is nothing wrong with coming here where you've got your textures and then coming in and maybe doing something like taking a crease brush and starting to add in some of your more stylized textures, something that looks a little bit more archetypally wood or stylized. Now, the secret to doing this well is a little bit like what we did with our other one, but it's more important here to start following the lines that you've actually set down with your textures and take advantage of what we've already got from this nice texture that we've laid down. And this really does give a nice, or I think a nice best of both worlds situation, where you've got the additional detail, but you've also got the harsher lines here that are going to make this more recognizable from distance as something to be wood texture, and it's going to make the person that's looking at this model want to come in a little bit closer. Of course, this is if you're 3D printing it, but this is quite nice. As I say, if you've got something further out, it's going to be recognizable as wood, just as this one is, but then if the person picks up the miniature and brings it closer, again, not if it's 28mm, you're not going to see this, but if it's something like 74mm, then you're going to then be able to pick it up and go, oh wow, look at that additional texture you've got there. And if you've used something like an ink wash to go over this, you're going to get those little individual bits of detail, as long as your printer is capable of handling this extra information. So a bit of fun there. Our stylized wood versus our realistic wood, or even with added some additional stylized lines to it. A quite nice combination of two different techniques for you to pick from. As always, I hope you found this video useful. If there's something you want to know more about, please do feel free to comment in the comment section. I'm always happy to take some ideas of what people want as tutorials. And if you do use any of these techniques, as always, I'd love to get a tag into some things to see what people are making.